Hello and welcome to the third webinar being hosted by Oppra in 2017. The focus of this third webinar is on how to include non-monetary values in decision making. We have three speakers to introduce this topic. They are Dr. Craig Bullock from the Environmental Policy Unit at the University College in Dublin, Ireland. We have Professor Ariane Walz from the Institute of Earth and Environmental Science at the University of Potsdam in Germany, and Diplom Engineer Katja Schmidt from the Institute of Earth and Environmental Science at the University of Potsdam in Germany. Now, during the webinar, we're very keen that you have an opportunity to ask any questions that you might have. And the way we would like to proceed with this is you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen a little box or an arrow pointing towards questions. And if you open up that question box, you'll see a blank field. If you type in your question there, it will be sent to my colleague Kathleen, and she will then alert me, and after the presenter has stopped speaking, I will go to the questions and give you an opportunity to ask your question. Unfortunately, we only have 1 hour for this webinar, so in case we're not able to take all questions, please be assured that the question that you sent in will be on the Oppla site, and if we can't deal with it in the webinar, you will receive a written response, and that will be on the Oppla site. So once again, we'll have 3 presenters. After each presenter speaks, I'll be opening up the floor for questions. If you have a question, please just type it into the question box, which is on the right-hand side of the screen, and we'll then pick the question up and make sure you get a response. If that's all clear, it's then my great pleasure to hand over to Craig. Dr. Craig Bullock is going to be our first presenter today, and he is going to be talking about how you include non-monetary values in decision making. So Craig, if you'd like to unmute yourself and put your presentation up on the screen, we'll then get going with the webinar. So a bit of patience, ladies and gentlemen, as we just try to put all these things in place. Craig, are you there? And there was silence. I will try again, or maybe my colleague Sarah from Unit WCMC, are you able to give Craig control, and is he able to access the system? We tested it about 15 minutes ago, ladies and gentlemen, so it should all work, but you never know. Here we go, I can see something is moving. Craig, are you there? Are you able to hear us?
I am, just about. I lost the internet connection there, I'm afraid, Martin, but I'm okay now, I hope.
Very good. Okay. Well, Craig, I think you're about to put your presentation up on the screen. We'll give you a few minutes just to do that. At the moment, we're seeing your laptop screen, so it says connect to the webinar. There we go. Fantastic. Craig, over to you.
Okay. Okay. Good morning, everybody. In this presentation, we are asking the question of how do we include non-monetary values in decision making. Sorry. Now, I'd like to begin by attempting to answer the question of why do we include human values? That's all kind of values in decision making. Well, these values are relevant because ecosystem services are an anthropological concept. Namely, they address the contribution that the natural environment makes to human well-being. And as such, we need measures or evidence of how important this contribution is, so that we can show what are the social costs and benefits to society, and to show how important different ecosystem services are relative to other political, social, or economic priorities, such as health, policing, or anything else. By demonstrating this value, we can hopefully ensure that sufficient attention and resources are directed at safeguarding and enhancing natural capital. We want decision makers, be they politicians, ministers, local planners, or business people, to recognize the contribution that natural capital makes to quality of life and to give sufficient priority to ecosystem services. Now, there are four principal categories of ecosystem services, of which the three taken to be relevant to decision making are namely provisioning services, such as the supply of food, timber, natural fibers, etc. Regulating services, which manage environmental quality. That could be aspects such as water quality, the role that vegetation plays in controlling erosion, etc. And cultural services. These are things such as amenity and recreation on the one hand, a relationship with the settings in which we engage in those activities, and other ways in which people interact with the natural environment. That could be through sense of place, sense of their own personal being, learning, etc. Now, some of these ecosystem services provide goods which can be valued using market prices, such as food products, but others do not pass through the market. They have no price. They are non-market, typically public goods whose consumption is shared with other people. And there are various methods available to value these goods. There are methods of non-market economic valuation, and there are non-monetary methods, including social valuation, which is the principal topic of our talk here. Now, the monetary methods, they can involve investigations into, for example, the contribution that an ecosystem service makes to a marketed good. I mean, that's just one way of estimating that value. For instance, there could also be the alternative expenditure that might be necessary to replace ecosystem services. For instance, by building a wastewater treatment plant to purify water, or building flood defenses to replace the natural service that wetlands or dunes might provide. But often monetary and non-monetary methods involve observing people's behavior, alternatively asking them directly how much they value the outputs of ecosystem services. Now, the Common International Classification of Ecosystem Services, or CISES, which has been developed by the European Environment Agency, uses the Cascade model to explain ecosystem services. And these can be thought of as commencing as flows deriving from the natural capital of, for example, forests, soils, oceans, etc., on the left-hand side of this slide. And moving to the right, these biophysical structures, or ecosystems, provide supporting and intermediate services, including those services we mentioned in the previous slide. And these in turn provide final goods and services and benefits which are valued for human well-being. We can value and may need to value ecosystem services at various stages in that cascade, but ultimately it is the value placed on final goods and benefits that matters most. Estimating this value also avoids the risk of double counting that could arise from adding value estimates for each stage in the process. As noted at the beginning, having an estimate of final values also influences the manner and degree to which we protect natural capital. And there is, in other words, a reverse flow or feedback loop from the recipients as human beings back to the natural capital that provides the ecosystem services, in terms of the pressures that we put on that natural capital, and also the investment that we place into sustaining the quality of that natural capital. In the CISES model, human beings are integral to the concept of ecosystem services. Now, notes on non-market monetary valuation methods. To explain non-monetary values, I often find it easier to describe the monetary methods used by environmental economists to establish the value of non-market goods, including ecosystem services. These methods are among the approaches most familiar to decision makers at present. They include methods such as continued valuation, which uses surveys to ask people how much they are willing to pay. For instance, how much they might be willing to pay as an increase in tax for a particular change, for example, an improvement in the flow of an ecosystem service. or perhaps their willingness to pay to prevent a deterioration in the same flow of that service. Alternatively, another method is called choice experiments, which may be used in which people are asked to value in a survey, they're asked in a survey to compare or trade off alternative packages. For example, alternative packages of ecosystem service goods, where these are described or comprised of characteristics or attributes. In this way, they can estimate the probability that a change in an ecosystem service will affect the choice of a good. And if in those list of attributes you include an attribute which is a monetary attribute, then that can be used to value the others in monetary terms. So these type of methods, they provide quantitative monetary values to inform decision making. And they're popular because they could be compared with costs, for example, in a cost-benefit analysis, and that appeals to many policymakers in particular. But these economic monetary methods do make certain assumptions. They assume, for instance, that people are rational beings, able to make informed choices, that we have well-informed preferences, that we know exactly where we stand in relation to these things, that those preferences that we have are well-established or fixed, in effect, and that, most importantly, I suppose, that we're motivated by a wish to maximize our utility, particularly in terms, I suppose, maximize the benefit to ourselves, in terms of the individual benefits to ourselves, one way or another. Now, for any economists in our audience, I should say that economists are not wedded to these assumptions, and there are ways around and ways to address them. But overall, we can say that economic methods are useful for valuing human interventions, especially where these are linked to policies which must be paid for example, through taxation. But they're more difficult to use to value other goods and values associated with indirect or non-uses of ecosystem services, such as the values we may attach to biodiversity or to unfamiliar species. That's where other methods might come in useful. So non-monetary methods, social, cultural, or social valuation. Social, cultural, or social valuation can be used to complement economic methods, or they can be used in their own right. They do not assume that value is based on preference alone, nor do they assume that values and preferences are fixed, but rather that these can be fluid and open to new information. Social values are not confined to personal utility. Rather, they are considered to be plural. They could represent many types of desires and intentions. On the one hand, you could, like Homer here, you could find yourself being pulled towards, let's say, selfish individual preferences. Alternatively, you might be guided by the principles of what is good for your community or the society in which you live. Now, there are other dimensions to the human-environmental relationship, including the notion of aesthetics, for example, the sense of the good life, the sense of living well, and ethics as well, a belief in what is right for other people, and also a belief in what might be right for nature, more sort of biocentric values, if you wish. In reality, we may be motivated by both, and on different occasions. Some people are more motivated by utility, their own personal utility, and others might be motivated by more community considerations, community values. So the whole host of different situations in which these values, different types of values might apply. But there's a considerable influence here for context, including our social relations and the culture to which we belong. In social values, there's a role for shared values and principles, not least because many public goods are experienced not just by the individual, but collectively, and therefore must take into account other people's values. And there's also a strong relationship with social and cultural institutions, and also with social capital. These type of values, they might be tangible, or they might be less tangible or intangible, including things such as spiritual values, which would be very important to many societies. And in contrast to the assumptions of economic valuation, they can be incommensurable. That is, they can't necessarily be measured in the same units. They can't necessarily be measured in monetary terms, and they can't necessarily be traded off like one good benefit for another. Sometimes you just can't compare different things. Types of social value and ecosystem services. Studies have shown that there are core, what are called transcendental values. I always find that a rather strange term, but core transcendental values that inform beliefs and which are common to many people and cultures. You know, things such as beliefs with regard to responsibility, belonging, that type of thing. And those core values, they inform the contextual values that we assign to such things as ecosystem services. These are values applied to all ecosystem services, including cultural services, where there is a direct connection with certain benefits and final outcomes. But also for regulating ecosystem services. Knowledge of regulating services is especially high amongst people who deal with nature on a daily basis, such as farmers, especially those in developing countries who might be more vulnerable to exogenous factors, including environmental change. It's possible to attribute values to these intermediate services, especially with the input and help of ecologists and other disciplines. For those of us in developed countries, we're not living on the edge in the same way, but we realize many of those ecosystem service benefits as cultural services. And there's a close link here between these and quality of life, including measures of subjective well-being. Cultural ecosystem service benefits include the value of landscapes for amenity and recreation, the value that we place on the environment in relation to a sense of place, ways of life, our own personal identity, all these different things that I mentioned on the earlier slide. They're important to special interests such as hunters, birdwatchers, anglers. And in practice, many of these values, they get bundled together with one another in people's minds and with human and abiotic factors. I'm thinking of the coastal case study that we had in the Opera's project. There could be values that are attached to various aspects of the natural environment, but they tend to get mixed up with also with recreational facilities that might be available. The presence of the sea, the fresh air, abiotic factors such as that. So it can be tricky to extract the values of specific ecosystem services, such as the ecosystem service of clean water for swimming. But it is possible. It's possible to do that. So methods of social and social cultural valuation. So I just introduced these briefly because I know that Ariane and Katia will be discussing some of the methods in more detail and with actual examples. But various methods are available, though a mix is often ideal. These methods include the use of workshops, where you bring people together for discussion or deliberation, or for what are known as citizens' juries, in which people pick over the evidence for a particular topic and debate that topic. They can include individual interviews with people, including semi-structured interviews, and these are often useful to explore narratives and to explore people's relationship with the environment through the conversational methods. They can include surveys, which might include more quantitative approaches, such as the use of scoring, or the Q methodology as well, which I won't go into, but is another method that is of a quantitative nature. There's also spatial or participatory mapping, in which people identify locations of particular value using maps, and that can be quite useful for planners, for example, to know where the areas which people value and why they value those particular areas. Or you can use visual approaches that call on people to vision alternative futures, or to express their values through pictures. There are also other methods such as the use of observation or analysis of how issues are discussed in social media, for example. Within these methods, there's usually some element of deliberation, discourse-based methods, sort of conversational situations where you try and get people to discuss, debate the particular values that they hold. And that's often done in workshops of maybe 10 or 20 people. They could be random members of the public, or they could be particular populations, subsets, or interest groups. Participants are generally presented with the issue and evidence, and they're encouraged to discuss and share values and knowledge, to engage in what we call social learning from one another, and also from the evidence that the research team might present them with. And they also draw. Also, what happens in practice is they tend to construct values. Once they receive this information, this range of information from one another, and the evidence from the research team, they tend to construct values. That's rather in contrast to economic methods, which assume that those values are already established. So remember that in social valuation, in contrast to economic valuation, those values are not fixed. And that's especially useful for ecosystem services, which may not be well understood by people at the outset. You have to go through a process of describing what they are. So just on the final slide now, because I don't have very much time, what are the benefits of this process for decision making? Well, the human-environment relations are quite complex, and these methods help us to understand those relationships. They can also be used to provide people with a better understanding of ecosystem services. And people have a good idea what ecosystem services are, but the concept might be very unfamiliar. So usually there's some sort of description that is necessary to explain to people what probably they know already. It also provides decision makers with a knowledge of the distribution of values, both in space and within the population. And they're an example of participatory decision making, so are useful for proper consultation and for democratic decision-making. And they can be used to reveal the limits of the acceptability of proposed actions. For instance, if a new development was going ahead in an area that might be valued quite highly by people for the natural environment. The social valuation is often non-quantitative. Rather, its value lies in its ability to provide an understanding and interpretation of the values that people hold. Those values can be perceived as along a continuum from sort of tangible utility values on the one hand to less tangible values at the other end. Nevertheless, it's possible to combine social valuation with other quantitative methods such as factor analysis or economic methods, perhaps to achieve a greater representation, given that social valuation is normally undertaken in small groups. Or you can combine it with economic valuation through a process what's called deliberative monetary valuation. And different methods of social value can also be included within a multi-criteria analysis, which is becoming a more established process to assess, for example, the virtues of going ahead with certain types of developments. Multi-criteria analysis means you can combine quantitative values with non-quantitative values, and you can combine values in different units to assist with the decision-making process. So that's a very quick introduction, I suppose, to some of the theoretical background behind social valuation and ecosystem services. I guess I'll now hand you back to Martin and then to Ariane and Katya to provide some examples of applications within the Oppra project.
Craig, thank you very much for that presentation. Now, we've got a couple of questions, and in a minute I'll be going to Alistair Scott with his question. But before that, quickly, Craig, two questions here from Dara Carroll at the Dublin Institute of Technology and Liz O'Brien at Forest Research. And both of them are asking a question about how does your presentation link to natural capital accounting, and in particular Liz O'Brien says a focus on natural capital accounting is making it more difficult to highlight the importance of non-monetary values. What key approaches do you suggest for highlighting the importance of non-monetary values in relation to natural capital accounting?
Yeah, natural capital accounting is becoming more popular now, I suppose, especially amongst companies that want to demonstrate some of their environmental credentials. And hitherto, they've tended to use rather quantitative estimates of natural capital. That means conventional economic methods, such as cost-based methods, for instance, to estimate the cost of replacing natural capital and that has been damaged. So for businesses such as, for instance, a forestry company, you might want to demonstrate the merits of the business by taking into account the benefits that forests provide for air quality, for flood moderation, for water quality, etc. You might also want to take into account the numbers of visitors to the forest, the spending that they engage in. And those methods, they can lend themselves to a lot of quantitative estimates using environmental economic approaches. It's more difficult when it comes to non-monetary methods. When you want to, and there are some benefits that forests might provide, for example, which you can't really explain using quantitative economic methods. So how do we do that? Well, the strongest argument I think for the social cultural valuation is it helps you to explain why those values are there, why people hold values for things such as forests. And that data isn't provided by the quantitative techniques that are available. But that's not that doesn't make it easy still to include in natural capital accounting. And there's a big debate going on even about the use of various environmental economic methods in natural capital accounting to take account of utility values. So it's even a step further to go and include social and cultural values. So it's a tricky one. I think you almost have to do it on a parallel level. And those social and cultural values, they become very important when you're considering any kind of development options. They become very important where you want to consider any change. But if you're just trying to produce some natural capital accounts for an organization or company, it's more tricky because accounts by their nature tend to be of a sort of quantitative nature. But that's not really a very satisfactory answer, so I'll think about that a little bit more.
All right. Well, Craig, we also have a question from Alistair Scott, and I'm about to hand over the microphone to him. Alistair wrote in saying the method that you're describing is only as successful as the way it is planned, executed, and fed back. Perhaps the trouble is that there are too many methods which are used uncritically. Alistair, anything to add to that?
Not really, in a sense. You went through the various methods that are there, and I see a lot of this happening with people advocating methods, but the problem is that we tend to lack the guiding principles to make sure that these processes are kind of designed, executed, and then fed back in a way that achieves positive outcomes, because we see a lot of very, very quick and dirty and possibly uncritically, they're used uncritically and used poorly because of the lack of really good principles that people do, because of the need to invest time and money in making sure that good processes take place.
Craig, your thoughts on that?
Alistair is right. We need some principles really as to especially when it comes to natural capital accounting at national level or company level. We need some principles as to what makes for the best method. Now, I know that's very true of economic methods, that there's a lot of work out there in terms of economic surveys that might have been undertaken using methods such as contingent valuation, etc. And you have to scrutinize them to see the quality of the application, to see if it's actually been done in a thorough way or not. But too often you just see the results of those applications reported. You also see consultancy companies sometimes. I do run a consultancy, but you see some consultancy companies sometimes who are just using these methods in a rather superficial way. And we need guidelines, but guidelines not just for the people undertaking the methods, but guidelines for the decision makers so that they can judge if these methods are of a suitable quality. The same applies to the social and the social cultural methods. There's a whole plethora of methods out there, and I did advocate the use of using a mix of methods because they all complement one another in various ways. And you can generally tell from the depth of the interpretation that is provided as to whether those social methods are of a sufficient quality or not. But that's probably easier for us as I suppose academics to do, and we're looking to be critical. We're looking for those things. But for the users, for the decision makers, it can be difficult for them to judge what is a good method or not. So we definitely need some principles there. I'd be totally in favour of that.
Okay, Craig, well, thank you very much. And I think this issue might be picked up by Ariana, our next presenter. So, Craig, thank you very much. I think we're now handing the microphone over to Ariana, who, Alistair, might well pick up on some elements of your question here as well. So, Ariana, are you online and ready to present?
Yes. Thank you, Martin, for handing over. Yes. Okay, I guess you now can see my screen. Okay, thank you, Martin, for handing over. Dear ladies and gentlemen, so in that presentation, I would like to ask the question, how can we use social cultural evaluation for ecosystem service assessment in practical applications? What are the key aspects to be taken into account to ensure that quality that you've just referred to? What are the first steps to actually set up a study that makes sense and is robust for practical application? Okay. Here I would like to present guidance towards setting up such a social valuation study. And for that, I draw from the experience that we get from 10 collaborative case studies that have been part of the Oppras project. As mentioned earlier, I'm Erin Bell. I'm from University of Potsdam, and I'm standing here for a group of people, including also the two other people who will give presentations today, Craig and Katja, and all of them are deeply involved in a number of local to regional evaluation studies. Okay. Hang on, I cannot move my presentation. Why not? Yeah, okay. So I go back to the already mentioned ecosystem service Cascade, and you can see that social valuation can be located here in the very far corner, far right corner. And we see that the biophysical structures and processes and the ecological functions are not the key entry point for our understanding of ecosystem services, but the perception of the people and the values that they assign to these ecosystems. This seems particularly important as people's perception and their values of ecosystems are often decisive when it comes to decision making for more or less biodiversity friendly or nature-based solutions. Okay. Here we want to enable planner and natural resource managers and local governments to set up tailor-made social valuation procedures. We want to show the bandwidth of valuation studies and the potential to adapt and combine such techniques. Ultimately, we want to encourage them to include this stakeholder perspective more frequently in their decision. As mentioned, we deduced this guidance from 10 empirical case studies. We distilled prototype applications from these case studies and discussed them in the group of experts and to then identify the main steps that it takes to set up such a tailor-made study. All 10 case studies aimed at operationalizing the ecosystem service concept for decision-making processes at local to regional scale. Of course, they all also had a special emphasis on social valuation. The 10 case studies include studies from different areas in Europe, namely from Ireland, Scotland, Portugal, Bulgaria, France, and Spain. They also cover multiple issues and ecosystems, such as urban dunes, restoration, wetland conservation, boating regulations, for instance, in the Balearic Islands, and also recreational issues here, for instance, in the Scottish Regional Park near Edinburgh. I would like to briefly now present some of the individual studies to give you an impression on their diversity and on the wealth of information that we could use to deduce this guidance. For instance, example 1 focuses on the measuring of current social value in that regional park. That means by active use of the park. Then we have a next example that focuses on better understanding various reasons for wetland restoration in Scotland. So that is more on why do people hold these values and preferences. Then we have a study from the traditional Montado landscape in Portugal, where people's visions for future foci in land management are investigated. And in our last example, stakeholder preference and accepted trade-offs between distinct management options have been identified here for a Bulgarian wetland ecosystem along the Danube. All these studies are also described in the guidance document that we produced, and they are part of that guidance document as illustrative examples. And the descriptions always include also exemplary results, as you can see here, and also how these results have been used or will be used in decision processes right in the area. Here, we combined the case studies and sorted them with respect to the main purposes, specific objectives, the addressees, their formats, and methods and tools they used. You can see here an overview. And then, what we came up with is the 4 main step procedure, and the first step includes the definition and the general purpose and the more concrete objectives of the, that will be followed in the study. The second refers to the people that will be addressed in the study. Once these fundamental steps are taken, we propose a number of regularly used formats for data collection. And last but not least, we also introduced a variety of methods that is typically used for different formats, different types of addressees, and for different purposes. So in the following slides, I just walk you through each of these steps now. First, here we differentiate between 2 very common foci in social valuation study. One is focusing on the assessment of the current value, whereas the second one focuses on the preferences for future states, including acceptable trade-offs in the future. Of course, both purposes go hand in hand with a number of typical objectives, such as, for instance, identifying and measuring the very current social value. The second step is the identification of the main addressees. Here, social valuation studies very strongly depending on whether affected people, decision makers, or experts of the system, or a combination of these groups are addressed. The third step looks at possible formats and shows what formats are regularly used in social valuation studies for different purposes. So workshops, interviews, and surveys are very common, and a bit less frequently used are observations and document analysis. And finally, we suggest a number of methods and describe them each, and depending on the addresses you have, the purpose you follow, and the format that you have chosen. To conclude, after all, we strongly believe that social valuation has, in theory and practice, the potential to make people's perceptions and preferences visible within ecosystem service assessment. And then we strongly recommend to learn from experience. We used these empirical case studies, we deduced main characteristics and discussed main steps for setting up valuation studies in the group of these experts involved. And then we want to provide the reader also with a catalog of prototype applications where exemplary results are also provided from each of the case studies that we included. And finally, we recommend getting in touch with experienced people, for instance, also via the community of practices, for instance, the Oppla, which is part of how many of you have been actually entered also this webinar. And last but not least, I would like to emphasize 2 more small points. This goes a bit into the direction what Scott just said, that we can of course use social valuation very yeah, not very purposefully and not very technically correct. And so we want to make sure that we understand that perception and preferences of stakeholders cannot replace biophysical assessments of ecosystems and ecosystem services. And they go hand in hand, and each of them has got a step in their own right, is a step in their own right. And although the processes are laid out to achieve concrete insights into the values of people and the values that they assign to the ecosystems, we want to make people also aware that often the valuation process itself is likely to trigger changes in the perception, in the knowledge, and in the preferences of all partners. So to some extent, of course, we want to achieve knowledge about the values as people hold it now, but just talking about it often makes already a difference. So with that, I would like to close, and thank you very much for your attention, and I'm open to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ariana. Well, we have a couple of questions here that be interesting to see your opinion on. The first relates to, you've been talking about social valuation of ecosystem services, but Julia Baker from Balfour Beatty was asking, how do you include these social valuations and ecosystem services into decision-making processes? What's the best way of doing that? And Bruce Howard of the Ecosystems Services Knowledge Network was also saying, what do you mean by decision-making? What's the scope of this term? And then how would social valuations link to that? So your thoughts really on, we understand social valuations of ecosystem services, but how do you link these to decision-making processes, and at what level?
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
How to link to decision-making? I think this depends a bit on the format. I think the format is very important, whether you really want to know about the values and understand how many people hold what value and what their preferences are. And if you want to look at it from a more almost democratic perspective, so if many people opt for one option or opt for one very prominent use in the landscape, or one very prominent ecosystem service, then that you would think twice whether you want to really decide against keeping these high valued elements of ecosystems. But then I think there's also a very discursive element to the social valuation study, which you cannot capture by surveys, and that would then rather be achieved by having more interactive formats like workshops, citizen juries, you know, really getting in a discourse, in a discussion with at least parts of the population, if not many, and really try to elaborate decisions that are acceptable for affected people too, for instance.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Ariane. We have to move on due to time constraints. However, just to remind everybody who's listening that if you would like to submit a question, on the right-hand side of your screen, you will see a questions box. If you open this up, you'll see a blank field, and if you type your question in there, we'll get that. Before we hand over to Katia, however, there is a final question that's just come in, and this is from Marilyn Valdivia, who says, do you think we need to propose new instruments for the decision makers according to the local context? What I would suggest actually is that, Katia, you proceed with your presentation, and then we'll pick that question up because I think your presentation goes some way to answering that. So Katja, over to you.
All right, thanks, Martin. Hi, everyone. My name is Katja Schmidt. I'm a... Oh, sorry.
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, yeah,
you
can
see you. There we go.
There you go, okay. I'm Katja Schmidt. I'm a PhD student at the University of Potsdam. And today I'll show you a tool that we developed for a study on social cultural valuation on ecosystem services for a case study in Scotland. We called the tool LandPref because with it we assess and visualize land use preferences. So in this short presentation I'll show you our initial application of it in the Pentland Hills Regional Park and describe how it works and what stands behind it really. Then I'll show you how it has been adapted since in other contexts and clarify how the tool can be used by others. Just to highlight this right at the beginning, LandPref is freely available under a Creative Commons license. So as long as you refer to us, you're free to adapt it and use it in your study as well. Okay, LandPref is an interactive tool for the assessment and visualization of land use preferences. We developed it as part of an app to be used on a tablet computer during an on-site survey with visitors of the Pentland Hills Regional Park in Scotland, close to Edinburgh. So in the study in the Pentlands, we were particularly interested in the relationship between social cultural values of ecosystem services and preferences in land use. After using it in a tablet-based on-site survey, we used it in an online survey as well. The online survey can be found online at the URL indicated here for you to try around if you're interested. But you can also find the link to the survey on our LandPref website, landpref.org. We deliberately left the survey online for anyone interested to try out the tool really, so it's not currently used for any other purposes. So how does LandPref work? LandPref enforces trade-offs between different land use choices and provides instant visual output of the respondents' preferences. So in our study in the Pentlands, respondents were asked to adjust this virtual landscape in regard to food provisioning, represented by sheep, habitat for wild plants and trees, which was represented by native forests, habitat for wild animals, which was represented by birds, wind farming, represented by wind turbines, climate regulation, which we linked to woodland directly, so it had no extra visual representation, and recreation, which was represented by use and infrastructure. All could be adapted on a scale from 0 to 5. Also, what's important is that built-in constraints limit the choices and challenge respondents to prioritize their selections and opt for trade-offs. For instance, if you were a sheep farmer in the Pentland Hills, you were naturally interested in the possibility of sheep farming in the Pentlands in the future, so you would likely put the slider to the highest amount of sheep. However, if you would also want a lot of woodland development, this would be a trade-off because those are competing land uses that can't be provided at the same time. So if you adjust the slider to a 5 for native forests, the sheep slider would automatically jump back and a warning message would pop up saying, forest and sheep farming are conflicting land uses, raising one may lower the other. And the participant then would maybe reconsider their choices. You also note that the slider of carbon sequestration is directly linked to native forests, as I said, so also triggering a warning message. So if one goes up, the other goes up too. If the participant deemed sheep farming and woodland equally important land uses, he would have probably chosen the medium development for both, which would have looked like this then. Other land uses that we found competing in our case study were, for instance, the development of bird habitat and woodland development. Here we assume that the largest variety of breeding and nesting habitats are provided by a diversified landscape composition. So that would consist then of a mix of heather, moorland in the Pentlands and woodland areas. Also, the development of wind farms limits bird habitat and increasing infrastructure and recreational infrastructure and recreational use limit bird habitat as well. So we based our trade-offs and synergies on current research findings and guidelines of practice, preferably from the regional context that we were working in. We published a full impact matrix of trade-offs and synergies in one of the publications about this study, which is open access, and you can find it here. At the end of the exercise, we asked participants how much inspiration this landscape that they have chosen provides for them. Their choice had no implication on the visual representation of the landscape and was supposed to be informative for us. So we got a lot of really good positive feedback on the tool and on our study in general. I took these quotes from the comment section of the online questionnaire, and we didn't record everything people said on site, but we were under the impression that participants were really enthusiastic about the opportunity to share their views about the Pentlands in general, which was in a large part showing their appreciation of the landscape as an area to experience the outdoors, so close to their homes. But we also had the impression that they enjoyed designing their ideal landscape and playing around with the tool a lot. So when I presented our study very recently to other scientists, I was asked why we chose rich pictures, or how they put it, comic-like drawings instead of photorealistic images, because they felt that they didn't resemble the Pentlands landscape very well. I guess the reason we didn't choose actual photos of the Pentlands was partly because we wanted to avoid the explicit spatial context to get more of a general vision of the Pentlands for the future, not so much of just one specific hill or reservoir. But from the conversations with participants, we also got the feeling that they found Landgraf to resemble the Pentlands very well, which was probably had to do with the fact that the images were drawn by an artist who grew up in the Pentlands himself. But that's enough of the Pentlands. So in the meantime, Landgraf has been adapted for 2 other studies. In both cases, the landscapes were adjusted, once for an assessment of land use and woodland expansion visions in Scotland, and once for the assessment of preferences for the development of energy landscapes in Germany. In both cases, not only the visual representations, but also the matrix of synergies and trade-offs were altered to a great extent. So this takes us to final comments on making use of Landgraf in a new case study. The 3 versions of Landgraf are all free to download on landgraf.org. So the Pentlands and the Scottish Highlands and the German case study as well, if you want to assess land uses in one of these landscape types. The apps are programmed in a way that they store a spreadsheet with the answers on the tablet, which you can then download and use for analysis. So if you'd like to adapt it in a different context, you would need rich pictures of your different land uses for your context. For the Pentlands study, we worked with a designer from Scarberia, a London-based company. They adapted the images for the study in the Scottish Highlands as well. And in the German study, a local designer was employed. As a next step, trade-offs and synergies need to be identified, and the impact matrix must be developed as well. So in the meantime, you should probably get in touch with us so we can either send you the code for the app if you have your own programmers or programming skills even, or we forward a request to the programmer that assisted us in creating the app, and you find an agreement with them to work with you. From our own experience, it takes about 2 months from developing the landscape in your head to having a working application on your tablet. And then all you need to do is find the right setting to use the app in. We applied it in a survey in the Pentlands, but we can also see it working in a workshop type setting, or in Germany it was used during a public event with real-time evaluation of landscape preferences, which worked really well too. So that's me. This is just to emphasize that Landgraf is one of the many tools that were developed by the Opera's partners. And please do get in touch in case you're interested in using a tool in one of your studies, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katja. We actually have a question from Dara Carroll, and I don't know if my colleague is able to unmute Dara Carroll, who has a direct question about Landgraf, and after that we will be going to Marilyn Valdivia and Matja Smit. But first of all, Dara, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, yes.
Please, your question about that.
The question was, particularly in relation to Landgraf, how well it can be used in urban landscapes and urban ecosystems. The case examples in the Scottish hills, and how might it work in the city environment? That's the question.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Dara. just in case that you couldn't hear that very clearly, Katja, the question was, can you also use LandPref in an urban environment, an urban ecosystem?
Oh, absolutely. I think you just have to adapt. Sort of, well, I guess the scenery would be quite different because it wouldn't be a landscape, but more of an urban setting. But I mean, depending on what you're interested in, I'm sure you can find a visual, you know, sort of image of that. And as long as you, you know, find your different sort of land uses or city uses that you're interested in, I think, and you can, you know, you can visually represent them in some sort of, well, you know, output. Then I'm sure you can adapt it for its, you know, urban context as well. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to invite Marilyn Valdivia. My apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name in any way, but Marilyn, your question, please.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for the presentation. With C4, we did an analysis of cultural ecosystem services in the Andes. So we understood these cultural ecosystem services respond to a multidimensional point of view for the people, no? Because the people can understand through the culture the other ecosystem services. So my challenge now is how we can create, or if you are agree or not, to create a tool for the decision makers, so an instrument that they can understand, or they can include this cultural ecosystem, the values of the people.
Very good. I'm not sure who would like to have a go at that. Maybe Ariana or...
Can you understand me? Yes. I'm not good. I'm not so sure whether I got your question correctly. So you say you're searching for how to communicate basically the results of your social valuation study to politicians or decision makers. Is that right? Can you just quickly confirm that? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So I wonder. I think as long as you are pretty close to the regional, you know, as long as you work on a regional to local level, I think it's you can explain. You don't have an occasion to transport and to communicate these results, or why is it so difficult? Maybe I don't really understand the problem. We usually draw.
Yeah, the idea is how to communicate all of these multi-dimensional values from the people, from among different users to the decision makers. So it's a bit difficult, I think.
To capture all of that complexity into a simple message, I think is the issue. Can
I maybe respond to that? Quick,
very, very quickly, so you've got a couple of minutes.
But maybe you can also get in touch with us again later, because there might be more to add, yes? But I think, for instance, when we had our results from Dependent Hills, there are some very simple messages that we could draw from these surveys and from these processes. But then, for instance, what are the mean preferences? But then there is, of course, the very interesting point that the preferences for the future that cover most people are not covered by all of them. And there are groups of people who have different preferences. And I think we always started to communicating with the, you know, the simple message. So this is what people would like to have if they have the choice. But then if you look at it closer, you have different users, you have different interests, and you need to prioritize between them. There is no way around that. Huh?
Thank you very much. I'm sorry we have to cut it short, but the basic message seems to be keep it simple. Craig, we have a question for you from Matja Smit. Mattia, are you on the line? Very briefly, your question.
Hello. First of all, thanks to all presenters for the presentations. And now a few quick questions for Dr. Craig. If he can, could you explain, please, more in details the linkages between ecosystem services and public goods? I mean, what kind of ecosystem services could be understood as public goods, in what ways, and how does this influence the governance and management of ecosystem services?
Okay, Craig, you've got 30 seconds to answer that, and then I think maybe send in a longer, more comprehensive written reply.
I think I'd have to, yeah. I mean, so many ecosystem services are essentially public goods. So many of those ecosystem services, for example, that maintain environmental quality in terms of erosion control, water quality, pollination, or so many different things are essentially public goods because they're shared by everybody. And the same would be cultural services as well. I mean, so many of those, for instance, landscapes, for instance, I mean, those landscapes are important public goods which contribute to people's well-being and quality of life. So, so there are so many different public goods involved there, and we're exploring people's relationship to those public goods through the means of social values. You know, whether people have an understanding of other people's relationships and what their own relationship is, and where they experience them and how they experience them. Does that answer your question? I think I'll probably have to go in a little bit more detail on the message afterwards.
Okay, Craig, thank you very much, and thank you all very much for your questions. I think please do have a look at the Oppla site. Craig and the others will be giving a bit more explanation in answer to your questions there, so look out for those written answers. But from my side, thank you all very much for attending this webinar, and I wish you a very good week, and perhaps see you same time next week for our 4th webinar series. Thank you very much. Goodbye.